Hi, well, whilst we're still in lockdown, I just thought I'd put this video together, which again isn't one of my normal films, but I just thought I'd like to share with you some of my early trips. Now, these aren't trips that I've necessarily made films of. In fact, all these trips were done in my younger days, long before my filmmaking. But some of the films that I've since made have been based on some of these trips. I'm including some of the walks I've done, cycling routes, and just general routes that I've done by public transport. If you've watched my film Chepstow and Lang Calls, you may recall that I spoke about spending my childhood in Chepstow, where my love of walking began. And the walk that I featured in that particular film was one of the very first I ever did. Living in the Wye Valley was a great place to discover the joys of walking, because there were just so many lovely paths to explore. There were two long-distance trails that started and ended around Chepstow, the Wye Valley Walk and Offa's Dyke Path, and I explored short sections of both those routes whilst I was growing up. Offa's Dyke Path in particular became an ambition of mine to one day walk the entire length of, which was, I think, 176 miles from south to north Wales. My years in Chepstow were spent mainly with my mum and my maternal grandparents, and we often would go for a drive in the Wye Valley or the nearby Forest of Dean. On my birthdays in particular, we would go for a picnic in places like Cannock Ponds, Simmons Yacht, and whilst we were there, I would sometimes go off on my own for a little while just to explore the nearby footpaths. In later years, when I was in my mid to late teens, my mum and I were living in the Bristol area, but I would still travel back to Chepstow to visit my grandparents. I would then ride on the buses all day. So from Chepstow, I'd say get a bus to Lydney, do a walk from there, and then end up at another point at the end of the walk, somewhere like Blakeney or Colford, somewhere where I could get another bus back to Chepstow. So that's what I used to do. I just used to travel around the buses all day, around the Wye Valley and Forest of Dean, and doing those walks, I got to know those areas in much greater detail. I won't try and list off all the walks I did because there were just so many, but they were great times. When I was 19, I joined the Youth Hostels Association, and my first trip as a member of the YHA was a walk from Chepstow along part of Offa's Dyke Path as far as St Revels, where I stayed at the youth hostel there, which was in the castle, of course. Now, I never really enjoyed sharing sleeping accommodation with complete strangers, I must admit, but hosteling was affordable in those days, and it was a good way of getting to meet other travellers. During my stay in St Revels, I did a few walks around the Wye Valley and Forest of Dean that were close to St Revels. And then after that I moved on to Welsh Bicknor Youth Hostel, where I spent a few nights. It was the following year when I really started my travels. In other words, places I'd not been to before, and a lot further away from home than the Wye Valley and the Forest of Dean. The first location I decided to visit was the Peak District. Now, I spent ages studying my YHA handbook, looking at all the youth hostels in that area, and studying the OS maps as to what routes I could do between the hostels. It was at the end of March 1986. I caught a train from Bristol to Stockport, where I caught a connecting service to Buxton in Derbyshire. Now, I can always remember as the train left the urban area of Stockport to enter the open countryside, I was completely blown away with my first sight of the Peak District. My first night was in Buxton Youth Hostel, and I spent the next 8 days walking in the spectacular countryside that was the Peak District. During that period, I walked to some amazing places, including Ladybower Reservoir, Monsall Dale, Bakewell, Lathkill Dale, Ilham Hall, Dovedale, Milldale, and Three Shires Head. It actually rained most of the time I was there, but not for 1 second did that ever put me off realising how beautiful the Peak District was. So, my very first trip to the Peak District will always be one of my favourite trips, because it was a beautiful area and also because it was my first real adventure on my own as a youth hosteler. My solitary rambler film that I shot in 2006, which I called Preamble in Peak, was actually based on this trip. I was bitten by the youth hosteling bug, so I looked to travel to more places where I could stay in hostels. I was into cycling in those days as much as I was walking. So in July that same year, I decided to travel around part of Wales on my bike. I cycled through part of the Wye Valley, so I went through Llandogo, Trellick, Penalt, and ended up in Monmouth that night to spend the night in a youth hostel there. Now, it was from there that the real adventure for me began, because I cycled further into Wales, and I remember a fantastic route in part of the Brecon Beacons where I cycled through the Vale of Ewis and I saw Lantony Priory for the first time. Wow, what a setting that was. I mean, the Vale of Ewis is just beautiful. So from the Priory I cycled on up and I spent the night in a youth hostel at Capel y Ffin. I don't know if that's still there now, but youth hostels could be so basic, but they actually could be located in some fantastic places, and Capel y Ffin was no exception. The following day I cycled on up the Vale and then descended over the Gospel Pass to Hay-on-Wye. And then that night I stayed in a youth hostel in a very small remote hamlet called Glascombe. I think that was in an old school building. Now from there I cycled to Builth Wells, up to Rhayader, and then I cycled up a very remote valley along this lane, staying in a youth hostel in a place called Nantadernal. Now that was just in the back of beyond, but it was lovely. But it was the next day I remember particularly looking forward to, and that was probably the main reason that I chose to do this particular cycling route, because I cycled to what my family and I always called the Elan Valley. But that's wrong, isn't it? It's the Elan Valley. So, the next day I cycled up through the Elan Valley, around the reservoirs and the dams. Oh, it's just a lovely day. And then cycled along this really remote mountain road which would eventually lead to Devil's Bridge. And then that night I stayed in a youth hostel not too far from there in a little village called Ystuntuan. And then the last full day I cycled from there, spent a bit of time in Devil's Bridge exploring, and then cycled on to Aberystwyth. And that was a lovely place to end the holiday, because Aberystwyth was where I could get a train back home again. I decided to do more trips on my bike, so I did a similar one later in 1986, where I cycled from home and finished at a location from where I could get a train back home again. Now, I'm not sure if it would have been around September or October time, but this was when I visited the Malvern Hills for the very first time, albeit briefly. Now, my journey took me through Eastner Park and along part of the A449, where I cycled through Malvern Wells and on to Lower Witch, where I stayed at the Malvern Hills Youth Hostel. Now, this brief sight of the Malverns was enough to make me feel that I needed to return at some point. Now, the following morning I cycled northwards on from Malvern, stopping for lunch at Aberley, and then I headed on and into Shropshire. Now, that's where I stayed at Wheathill Youth Hostel, which was on part of a farm. I then enjoyed cycling through more of Shropshire to visit Wenlock Edge, Much Wenlock, and Iron Bridge, which I loved. There was a youth hostel in Iron Bridge, based in Coalbrookdale, where I stayed that night. The Iron Bridge Gorge, being the birthplace of the Industrial Revolution, had several attractions, and I decided to spend part of the next day in the Blists Hill Victorian town. It was a great place, a recreated Victorian town with authentic shops, cottages, workshops, factories and mine workings. After that I cycled to Shrewsbury, which I thought was a lovely place. This was my last day in Shropshire, so after I spent that night in Shrewsbury Youth Hostel, I got the train again back home the following day. My maternal grandparents absolutely loved their caravanning holidays. Now as a kid, my mum and I often went with them on some of their holidays. My first caravanning holidays were in West Wales, and we always went to Tenby and Saundersfoot in Pembrokeshire. As a 19-year-old, when I was a member of the YHA, I looked at this part of Pembrokeshire, and I found that there were actually several hostels around the coast, but not anywhere near Tenby and Saundersfoot. But I thought, great, I'll go and discover the area a bit more. So in early 1987, I took a train from Bristol, changed at Swansea, and terminated at Haverfordwest. Now from there, I remember walking 7 miles along the main road to Broadhaven. But Broadhaven was lovely. It was a lovely part of the coast, and that's where I spent the first night in the youth hostel there. So, over the course of the next few days, I walked along a huge section of the Pembrokeshire coast path. So I went through places like Newgale, Solva, the wonderful city of St David's, which was just a lovely place, and I stayed at the youth hostel near there. There was White Sands Bay, Aberystwyth, Trevine and the youth hostel in that village, Abermawr, and ending up at the fantastic Clifftop Pool Derry Youth Hostel. On the last day, I just walked across country to Goodwick, from where I got a train back home again. I think what has to be one of my very favourite trips happened in May 1987, and that was when I went to the Lake District the first time. I knew of the Lake District, of course, because many people had spoken about it to me and how lovely it apparently was, so it just seemed the obvious place for me to visit at some point. There were plenty of youth hostels in the Lake District, so I planned a trip to visit there for a week in May 1987. So I looked at the OS map again to look at routes between all the hostels that I could walk. So when I travelled by train to the lakes, I remember I had to get off at Oxenholme, which is near Kendal, and then get another connecting service from Oxenholme to Windermere, which is where the line terminated again. So the first night was in Windermere Youth Hostel, although it was actually 2 miles north of the town. It was a great night though, and I can remember looking around me thinking, yep, I'm going to like the Lake District. Over the following week then, I walked around Claife Heights, Hawkshead, staying in the youth hostel there, walking through Grisdale Forest to Coniston and stopping in that hostel. I remember Tarn House being really lovely, and walking from there to Skelwith Bridge and up through the lovely Loughrigg Tarn to stay at High Close Youth Hostel. Next day, walking to Little Langdale and back to Eltwater to spend that night at the hostel in the village. On from there and climbing over the mountains to descend to Grasmere Lake and town of the same name. I explored Dove Cottage whilst I was there, which was William Wordsworth's home, and then stayed in the youth hostel in Grasmere that night. The next day I did a walk past Rydal Water to Ambleside, staying at the hostel beside Lake Windermere. My final night was back at Windermere Youth Hostel, so it was easy for me to get the train back home again. I can't speak highly enough of the Lake District. The scenery was just sublime. I loved the atmosphere. I just thought the Lake District was fantastic. My solitary rambler film Wayfarer of Windermere, which I shot in 2013, was actually based on this very first trip to the Lake District. I'd like to jump ahead to 1990, because that was the year I first went to Scotland. Now, I was 24 by this time, and I discovered that there was a special rail ticket that you could buy for the under 25s, and that enabled you to travel anywhere within Scotland by train, I think within a 12-day period or something. So that sounded like a great idea. So again, I booked a week off in May that year, and I went to Scotland by train, and it was a very unusual trip actually, because I'd never done anything like this before. All my trips up until then, and anything I've done since then, I've always planned so well in advance, meticulously planned. So I've always made sure that I know what routes I'm doing, booked all my accommodation in advance, but this time I hadn't done any of that. Although I had a general idea of where in Scotland I wanted to visit, I hadn't booked any accommodation in advance at all. So it was basically a case of hopping on a train somewhere and thinking, oh, I like this place, I'll book a night's accommodation here whilst I'm there. So that was a very different kind of trip that I've not really done before or since then. So the first day I travelled to Edinburgh. I didn't really see much of Edinburgh, but I got the train from Edinburgh, which crossed the Forth railway bridge, and then I got off at Pitlochry, which I thought was fantastic. That was one of the favourite places I went to in Scotland. So after spending a night in Pitlochry, I went to Aberdeen, spent a little bit of time in that city, and then from there I went to Inverness. Now, I don't know why that photo was taken of me with those two guys, but I'm guessing what must have happened is they probably just got talking to me. They saw me with my rucksack. They probably had a few to drink, so one of their friends got them to take a picture of me with them. So I got to Carla Loch that evening, stopped in the B&B there that I'd pre-booked at Inverness. I travelled south, and I remember travelling around that part of the west coast of Scotland was just incredible. It was lovely. And I ended up getting off at Fort William. So I went into the tourist information office there, and I got them to book me a night's accommodation. The only place that was available was a remote place, was about 4 miles out of Fort William. So it was just wonderful. I remember arriving there and I just felt so welcome. Anyway, one of the things I had to do whilst I was staying there was climb Ben Nevis. So I remember, because it was a hot day, I was wearing my shorts and t-shirt, I had my rucksack with me, but by the time I got to the top of Ben Nevis, I was wearing everything that I had in my rucksack, so I was really wrapped up. I don't know who it was that would have taken this photo of me and this other guy on the summit, but they obviously didn't take a very good picture, but I think you can see it's me on the summit there. So anyway, continuing my train journey, I caught the train from Fort William and then spent the last night in Glasgow. And Glasgow I thought was a nice city actually. The little I saw of Glasgow I liked very much, and I was there when it was the European City of Culture, so that was great. So I spent the last night in Glasgow, and then the next morning I got the train back home again, and I think I was able to get a train directly through to Bristol without having to stop and change anywhere else on the way. So yeah, that was fantastic. Well, I'll just briefly talk about one more trip, and that was going back to when I was talking about living in Chepstow as a child, and my childhood ambition was to walk the whole length of Offa's Dyke path. Well, in August 1990, I finally fulfilled that childhood ambition. So I took 2 weeks off work, and I think over a 12-day period, I walked all of Offa's Dyke path from start to finish. So I started at Sedbury Cliffs, where it begins, near the Severn Estuary, and then on the last day, I ended up at Prestatyn in North Wales, where it finishes. So that was just the greatest walk I've ever done. Probably because it was a childhood ambition that I finally fulfilled. But it was just wonderful because, you know, it was literally a walk from A to B over 176 miles, I think it was. And like, you know, the first full day I walked part of the Wye Valley. The next day was like a walk through rolling countryside, sort of northwest of Monmouth. And then it was across the Black Mountains the next day. And then so on and so on. It just varied every day. I think probably the best stretch has to be the Wye Valley on the first full day, but I'm probably biased because that area I knew better anyway as a child. But it was superb scenery. But I think another day which I thought was particularly spectacular was the Vale of Llangollen. That was wonderful. I always remember seeing Llangollen down in the valley from where I was walking along Offa's Dyke path and just thinking what an amazing view that was. And probably the Clwydian Hills as well, sort of on the last couple of days. That was spectacular too. So I won't talk too much about my trip along Offa's Dyke path because I did make a film of this, which was Mound of Mercia. And ironically, that's probably my least favourite film that I've made. But I might talk about that another time. But anyway, that was the greatest walk I ever did. Well, that's an account of some of the trips that I've done in the past before my filmmaking. So, yeah, good times and good memories.